Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our conversation with International Sustainability Consultant Jack Whelan. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we gather today, including those of the Darug, Tharawal, Eora, Gundagara, and Wiradjuri people, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this conversation with the Academy. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Western Sydney and beyond. Thank you for joining us today. This conversation will be recorded so that it can be shared throughout the Academy. We received a range of questions from students who are interested in this session that we'll address in our conversation today. If you have any others, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll refer to them at an appropriate time in the conversation, or we'll catch up with them at the end. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Jack Whelan, who I've worked out for the first time in 1997 in my first professional role as a graduate, but we'll come to that chapter in Jack's career later on. In this conversation, Jack, we'd like to hear about your career path and your advice for students hoping to work in the international sphere as well. So let's start, if you don't mind, with what you studied. It was environmental science and resource management. Why did you choose this pathway?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wendy. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to speak with you and all the students who are going to be tuning in to view this. It's a great pleasure to be able to sort of reflect on some of these challenges and pathways that I followed in my career, and I'm hoping that it's of value to the students. So thanks, Wendy, for setting it up. Thanks also to the students for all the various questions that they've submitted, in advance of this. It's certainly made prepping up for this very easy and thought-provoking for myself, because although it's easy to recall all the various things that I've done in my career, it's not always easy to remember why I did them. And so being able to have an opportunity to reflect on the whys has been really important. So yeah, look, thanks. The question really about why did I choose that particular pathway, I came from an academic background, medical science, my father, but my brother chose to do ecological science. This is, the students won't know this, but of course, back in the 1970s, the environmental movement was very much at its kind of commencement. It was really at the time when there was growing concern about pollution generally and, the human impact on the environment. And I really was interested in that. It was also a time, though, it was long before climate change really became the hot environmental issue. It was more people's concern about pollution generally, from things like nitrates in the water, pesticides in the food supplies, animal welfare on farms and this kind of thing. And in year 11, I moved to the UK with my family. And so these were the big hot issues in the UK at the time. So I chose environmental science, but not what I would call urban environmental issues, the built environment. I was more interested in the rural or the agricultural kind of issues at the time. So it was more the natural environment rather than the urban environment. And that's really what got me interested in the whole environmental advocacy and environmental management generally, and policy making to favor the environment. And then later on, of course, it became broader in terms of sustainable development, where marrying the interests of environment, the economy, and social welfare. So that was really why I chose that pathway.
And Jack, after you graduated, where did that area of study lead you in your first job?
Yeah, the thing was that I was very fortunate because at the time, very few universities, not just in this country, but even in Britain, actually offered environmental science as a degree at all. And so I was fortunate to be one of the first at the University of London to actually do an environmental science degree, but it was within the agricultural faculty. So I was surrounded by people who were doing agricultural science of various descriptions. And most of those, or many of those, followed a career into international development, but it was agricultural development. And so because it was Britain, most of the international interest of development, it was in Africa. So a lot of them went into the government agency that was in charge of overseas development, it was called then. And but because those agencies were not really concerned with environmental management, there was really no place for me to go down that pathway. So I followed what most of my peers and went into what I was really interested in, which was land management in national parks and the natural environment within protected areas, which was a growing area, a growing sector at the time. So it was great. But once I got into it, I realized that, you know, being a national park ranger is great. You're outside, you're working with wildlife and all the rest of it. But there was a bit of a barrier because, you know, once you're a park ranger, you're always a park ranger. Really, there's not much opportunity to progress above. And going into management meant that you then went into a desk job anyway. So you sort of lost the appeal of what the reason why you went into it in the first place. So my first jobs were very much around national park management, but it didn't take me long to realize that actually that was a sort of temporary phase, and I kind of wanted to move on.
Right. And so where did you move on to after that? And how did you move on?
I guess because I was already an international student, if you like, because I had moved from Australia to England. And so I was already considered reasonably international, but what I wanted to do was to explore a more international career. And that meant leaving Britain and going overseas. But I knew I couldn't do that, and I was told I couldn't really do that until I had another qualification and international experience. And so it was very, very clear that I would need to get a master's degree, and I would need to get some international experience. And so that was really what prompted me to kind of up sticks again. And then that quest for international experience meant that even though I did my master's degree in the UK, I did it in Scotland, but what I did was I did what I had done before my first degree, which was to have a gap year. In fact, with my first degree at the University of London, a gap year was compulsory in my college at the agricultural faculty. Now, it wasn't compulsory for the master's degree, but it was expected that you had been in the workforce or you'd been following some sort of career progression before you did your master's. So I took the opportunity to have another gap year and came back to Australia. And so what prompted me to move on in each case was this desire to travel, but to gain experience through that travel, and to prepare myself for a master's degree, which in itself was very international, because out of about 20 students that I was with, only about 3 of them were from the UK. The rest were from all over the world.
Terrific. Now, Jack, we have circulated a link to your LinkedIn profile, so students will know that you've worked for a broad range of organisations, from the International Fertiliser Industry Association. You've also worked for the International Chamber of Commerce, the Asian Development Bank, its agency, the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Fund, also Sustainable Business Australia, so moving into the business sector as well, the Foundation for Development Cooperation, Flora and Fauna Australia, just to name a few. They span quite a few different areas in terms of intergovernmental, non-profit, business sectors. What is it that's allowed you to move between those different areas?
Look, I think that it sort of looks a little bit uncoordinated, and a little, you know, when you look at that, as you say, it's a diverse range of organizations, but there are consistent themes, really. It shows that during the 1980s and the 1990s, there was such growing awareness of environmental issues or sustainability type issues that all of these organizations were having to adapt. And in a sense, it was almost, I wouldn't say inevitable, but it was very desirable for me. If I was going to be valuable to any of them, I had to have some kind of a broad awareness of how different sectors and how different institutions and how different countries absorb these new challenges. So the business community was a very interesting one, because very quickly I realized that you could be an environmental campaigner, the protester who's sort of, you know, the Greenpeace sort of protester who's out there advocating, waving banners, occupying oil rigs, you know, forming picket lines, that kind of thing. Or you can, if you like, work with the enemy. You can start to try to integrate yourself with a sector that was in trouble. The business sector were being really criticized for the fact that they were intensely responsible for a lot of the environmental misdemeanors, whether it's pollution or greenhouse gas emissions or whatever. So I kind of knew that it would be, for me, it would be not, I wouldn't find it very interesting to just be a protester on the outside. I wanted to be on the inside, effecting change, and doing that through sort of encouragement of policy reforms within things like the business community. And it was very interesting that at the time, I'll give you an example. When I joined the Fertilizer Association, the International Fertilizer Association, of course, as I said before, most of the challenges that they had were about, you know, pollution from nitrates and from, you know, the waterways and things. But climate change was just becoming the sort of the big issue globally. And the fertilizer industry began to understand that they were having a huge impact themselves, because at the time we calculated that about 2% of global energy consumption is used to manufacture fertilizers, which is enormous. It's phenomenal. And so therefore their impact on greenhouse gas emissions was much larger than they actually thought. And not only that, but when you use fertilizers on the land, it produces a lot of nitrous oxide, which is an even more potent gas, greenhouse gas, than carbon dioxide. And so the captains of the businesses within the fertilizer industry globally suddenly started to think, my gosh, we're going to be hit with all sorts of punitive measures, you know, whether it's a carbon tax or some kind of cap on the amount that they're allowed to emit. And this was considered a serious threat to their business. So they started asking me, you know, right, well, you're the guy who can tell us what to do about this. And so that sort of, I think, showed why it was important that for my own career development, that I really worked within these different organizations. And it was later on in my career when I then went back into, or circled around and came back into working in the international development community, and not so much within business organizations. But I think that shows a really good example why it was really important to have this diversity of experience.
Yeah, definitely, Jack. And throughout that circling back, you obviously have a big network of professional contacts who touch on the same areas, but in different capacities on network.
Sure. Well, you know, that's an interesting point too, because there's no doubt that the way to build your sort of networks, especially internationally, is that, you know, as I said, you need to travel and you need to really make a concerted effort to get in touch with people. Now, of course, back in those days, you know, we didn't have the benefit of social media. We didn't have the benefit of these kinds of communications that we've got now. So a lot of it was around literally traveling and visiting offices and knocking on the door and introducing yourself and saying, hi, I am who I am. I've got this. Or as well as that, writing letters. In fact, writing letters to organizations saying, I'm coming to visit your country and I would like to come and see you. And that was a really good way of developing networks. And I would certainly encourage students to realize that, you know, emails and social media now are so ubiquitous that people working within these organizations are so flooded with information and with approaches and everything that sometimes maybe going back to the traditional methods is not a bad idea, that they kind of want to meet people in person, and so that's a really good way to develop networks, and it differentiates you from, you know, the rest.
Terrific. Thanks, Jack. Some people aren't that keen on networking, but it is nice now that there are lots of different ways that we can connect with people. And just for the benefit of the students, I had a conversation earlier, and I have a holiday planned, and Jack flagged that that's a really good opportunity if you're traveling. Why not do a quick internet search beforehand and see if there's some companies or organizations in your destination that you might be able to pop into and have a word with while you're there, and take advantage of those opportunities. And that's certainly something that I've been prompted to do, and it's definitely been successful. Jack, now you mentioned when you were working for the International Fertiliser Association, your role kind of morphed a bit more into, from your communications position, into becoming the go-to person for environmental questions and challenges. How much autonomy have you had in, how much did you have in that position, and also the other work that you've done since?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the shift, if you like, from being a communications person, somebody who's good at advocacy, good at public relations. As I said before, the thing is that I was beginning to get asked technical questions. You know, how can we modify our systems to reduce emissions, for instance, or how can we cope with the new challenges that are being presented to us? And so the fertilizer industry literally said to me, we want you to go to the United Nations in New York and sit down with all of those big conferences that are addressing climate change and really understand what's going on. What is this Kyoto Protocol? What is an international carbon trading system? They really didn't understand any of it. It was remarkable to think that captains of industry, CEOs of major multinational companies, really had very little appreciation of what was happening at a global level. And so when you talk about autonomy, it's kind of, you know, now I reflect back on it, I realized that there I was in New York, sitting in the United Nations, being expected to give speeches on behalf of a huge international industry federation. And so there's nothing more autonomous than that. You feel very alone and isolated. But you have to know what you're talking about. And so an appreciation of what's the correct policy measures that are needed to address these issues meant that I needed to then get in touch with the experts within groups like the United Nations Environment Programme and other. So again, my network was expanding very quickly. And but I guess working in a sort of a cutting edge type of area gave automatic autonomy. It was like you were as you said, I became the go-to person, which I'm not sure, just because I happened to be there and because I had this environmental sort of background, I was suddenly in the hot seat. And some people would say, and in fact, a lot of my peers at the time said, oh, but you're just, you know, a traitor. You're now batting for the other side. How can you sort of reconcile that with your own beliefs and your own instincts? And I always said, well, actually, I don't know. I think I'm actually making more change by doing this. And that's what then led me into the International Chamber of Commerce. And then it became, you know, a really big sort of representation role, because it was not just for an agricultural industry like fertilizers, but it was for all business sectors, all industry sectors in the whole world of climate change. And so then it sort of grew as the issue grew, and it became more and more evident that climate change was going to be the dominant sort of environmental issue globally. So again, then I became even more autonomous, despite the fact that I had a huge organization that was helping me to assemble all the information that I needed.
Terrific. So that's a really great example, Jack, of having a cause that you're passionate about, the environment and resource management, and approaching it in lots of different ways. So, for example, through communications, through advocacy, then also in different platforms, whether within one industry or within a whole sector, say agriculture, for example. So finding the niche that you fit best into, and finding a pathway that you may not have known about at the outset that you can pursue in your career, based on the factors outside, the global economic factors or environmental factors, socio-political factors and constraints, and just following the path where your expertise and your passion lies.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a question that relates a little to the previous one, from one of our students asking about career hurdles or difficulties other than being expected to be a spokesperson at a very high level and perhaps finding that a little daunting at the start. And how did you approach those challenges and hurdles?
Yeah, look, I was thinking about that. It's career hurdles and sort of challenges. I guess, you know, when you're working within these kinds of organizations, whether it's a small NGO, like a non-governmental organization, or a charitable group, or a business organization, or, you know, all of these institutions, like everyone, they all manage finances, they all have to get revenue from somewhere, and then they have to find ways to deploy those resources. And so everything boils down to financial management. And I guess through my career to that point, I began to realize that if you're going to get involved in management or at a sort of directorial level within any of these organizations, you know, you're employing staff, you're having to manage travel budgets. All of a sudden, financial management becomes a really important tool. And I didn't really have any of those sorts of skills. I didn't have, you know, I couldn't do an Excel spreadsheet. I still can't really do an Excel spreadsheet very well. I'd like to go back and learn how to do it properly. So I guess I began to realize that some of those skills were absent. And so later on, when I wanted to literally get into, you know, governance of these organizations, I realized also that then I should go and do a course like the Company Directors course at the Australian Institute of Company Directors. That was an important tool to have in your toolbox. But I think that some of these other skills like financial management, economics, even for an environmental management advocate like myself, these are really important. And the other one I would say is languages. You know, I wish I'd paid more attention, and I wish I had done more languages when I was younger, whether I was a student or even at school. I ended up living in France for the best part of a decade, and unfortunately still didn't really master French as I should have done. But that was because I was working very much in an English language environment. But I think if you're going to be effective working at an international level in this kind of, or in any kind of field, I think an appreciation of languages and cultural awareness is really important. So, you know, all of these little hurdles, they're not little, they're all big hurdles, but I think you need to realize that they all help.
Thanks, Jack. Now you've worked all around the world. Now you're based in Sydney. How do you continue to work in the international sphere from here?
Yeah, look, that was one of the, I guess it relates also to another career challenge that I think everybody faces at some stage or another. And that is that, you know, you may find that your partner or your spouse or your family or whatever have a slightly different trajectory in terms of their career pathway, and they may want to follow a different direction, or that you might have children and that you might decide that you want to move country for educational reasons, all sorts of reasons. And that happened to myself. And so moving country can sometimes be a real challenge and a real hurdle. And so when my wife and I decided to move back to Australia more than a decade ago with a young child, that became actually quite a big career challenge. And so I very quickly had to sort of, because I hadn't really lived in Australia for any length of time since I was a teenager, I had to kind of suddenly and quite strategically redevelop my network in Australia and trying to get in touch with the right people. And I quickly realized that Sydney actually is very beneficial from an international development perspective, because a lot of, especially for the Pacific region, Sydney seems to be the regional headquarters for a number of the big international organizations like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. They all have offices in Sydney because it's such a convenient sort of regional hub for the Pacific region and New Zealand. So once I realized that, then I sort of wanted to get involved and got in touch with those organizations. And so repatriating to Sydney then became part of that sort of international quest. And I didn't feel in any way restricted, but I think I would have done if we had gone back to any of the other Australian cities. It's just that we were very fortunate that Sydney was our home then, from then on. And I guess it kind of gave me an opportunity to focus much more on the Asia Pacific region. And that was beneficial too, because, you know, and the thing about working at a truly global level all the time is that you actually don't really dive into much depth in any one particular area. Whereas being able to focus on the Asia Pacific area has been really good. And of course it was timely, because it was very much, it sort of matches Australia's general priorities in terms of the region.
Terrific. And can you tell us a little about some of the projects you're working on right now?
Yeah, look, I mentioned the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, and, you know, the Australian government's development program through DFAT, that used to be called AusAid, the Australian Aid Program. Of course, they all, as I said, they all have a strong level of support for the developing countries in the region. And if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, as they've invested in primarily infrastructure, that's their sort of bread and butter, is to support these countries develop their infrastructure. Of course, they've really attracted a lot of people who have an engineering background, or they have economic management background, or they have banking and finance backgrounds. Because that's really the focus of how those projects work. You know, it's only relatively recently that these organizations have really understood that a lot of the major development challenges in the Pacific particularly are actually environmental management or sustainable development challenges. And one area that I've been working in a lot recently is in waste management, because of course, all of these countries are producing, like we are, a lot of waste, plastic waste and organic waste, and all sorts of metals and rubber and tires and batteries and all the rest of it. But these other small countries in the Pacific have got very little opportunity to be able to manage it or deal with it effectively. And they've got a very small land area. They've got extremely rudimentary sort of landfills, which are full and overflowing. And they've got very few other opportunities to be able to you know, not much recycling, because there's such a small market. So even the recycled material doesn't find its way into the market very easily, and it costs a lot to transport, especially waste. So that's one of the most interesting and I think rewarding issues that I've been involved in a lot recently, is working especially on plastics, and how it's so interesting that the Pacific countries themselves are fully aware of this, that they rely so much on, for their economies and for their economic development, on fisheries and tourism. Many of the countries are dependent on those two sectors. And yet those are the two sectors that are really almost, you know, predominantly affected by pollution from plastics and other things. And so it's important that they get it right. So those countries are really looking for real innovative ways, technological solutions to try to address the issue. So I find that really exciting. And, you know, it's kind of like looping, as I said, back to where I was very much interested and involved at the beginning of my career, when, you know, it's right back in that sort of area of addressing the pollution problems that afflict the region.
I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Jack, but how do we solve that one of plastics in the Pacific? What sort of solutions do we have?
Well, it's not just the Pacific, it's here as well, everywhere. It's probably one of the biggest sort of challenges that we've got. How do we solve it? It's like everything, there's no one single solution, and climate change is the same. I noticed there was one of the questions that the students were raising was saying, you know, how do we prevent climate? What's the most beneficial way to prevent climate change? Well, you know, I don't think we are going to be able to prevent climate change. And just in the same way, we're not going to be able to prevent plastics pollution, but we can find ways to kind of moderate it and ameliorate it, and find clever technological solutions that might actually find benefits. But in plastics, you know, I think we have to take our responsibilities as well. We meaning the developed world, not just Australia. And in the Pacific, that basically means Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, you know, all the various surrounding developed countries have to realize that most of the products that the Pacific Islands are buying wrapped in plastic or plastic packaging, they're coming from here. So once you start looking at the opportunities that are presented through the circular economy, we have to realize that actually it's our responsibility perhaps to start looking for ways to repatriate some of that material back here. Because that's not happening fast enough, a lot of the Pacific countries are actually saying, we can't wait for that. So what we're going to do is ban the import of this material. So polystyrene, for instance, is now banned as a packaging material imported into Fiji, for example. And so, which is really exciting, because as soon as they ban it, suddenly everybody has to now look for alternatives to what do you use as an alternative for that packaging material? Well, we've got to start researching for effective biodegradable alternative materials. And that's where I think universities and institutes of research can really now start making a contribution, is to look for those alternatives. So it's a combination of policy measures. It's stimulating a market for alternatives which are better environmentally, and also looking at policy measures that would restrict the use of the harmful material. But those two things have to happen, you know, in sync, because otherwise we end up with all sorts of market distortions which are not helpful to global trade and not helpful to the economies of those countries. So like everything, it's not a simple solution. It's a very complex answer.
Absolutely. It touches on, as you mentioned, policy, business research, the environment, local and global factors all involved there. And you did touch on climate change, which was a question raised by the students. Would you like to just briefly recap how you think we can address climate change? You've mentioned already that it's complex. Are there any specific factors regarding climate change that may be different to, say, plastic waste?
Yeah, you know, again, it's like when in the context of sustainable development in the developing world, you know, of course, we all know about the fact that China and India are, you know, some of the biggest emitters, and that they're reluctant to sort of or limit their economic development in any way, and the developed countries are expected to take a leading role, and that includes Australia. But I think we also have to realize that there are opportunities, not just business and social opportunities to introduce better systems, better technologies and other things, but also there's a way to if you like, create hybrid solutions that doesn't provide, doesn't challenge the development of these countries. I'll give you a sort of an example of what I'm talking about. So often, the sort of the buzzword around energy, adapting our energy systems is to install renewable energy, and that's great, solar panels and wind turbines and all the rest of it. When you go into the developed world and take the Pacific, for example, all the development agencies are saying, yes, well, we can come and we can help to provide finance for them to develop solar panels, for instance, and solar systems in the Pacific. But often that also then means bringing in batteries for storage and the challenges that brings, because we're actually also bringing in a lot of material which will become waste if we're not careful. And I know of all sorts of examples where large lead acid batteries, when they reach the end of their life, they use them as boat anchors in the lagoons, and that's not very healthy. And so sometimes we have to think, well, hang on, it might be a good climate change solution, but it might not be a good sustainable development solution. And so while we're transiting from fossil fuels to renewable energy in the context of, say, the Pacific with solar systems, what we might do is help them to use, instead of a battery as a backup, to use LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, LPG. We use it every day in our barbecues and our street heaters and all sorts of things. So we know LPG is safe and it's very mobile, it's very transportable. Cylinders can be moved around easily and refilled. And the Pacific all have LPG for cooking and heating and refrigeration and all sorts of other things. So it's already there. It's just that the development agencies don't want to advocate it because it's a fossil fuel and they don't get any support now for advocating a fossil fuel solution. So I'm suggesting that actually it's not the solution, it's a temporary solution to create a hybrid, in other words, a model where you benefit from the renewable energy during the day, but you've still got a backup for things like cooking and lighting and other things at night without using a battery, and not introduce batteries until we've got better waste management systems to cope with the electronic waste and the battery waste that comes afterwards. So that's what I keep coming back to, the same point, that it's not there's no one single magic bullet. We have to look at all these hybrid solutions all the time.
Yes, certainly. And the context makes such a big difference. For example, as you said, on large continents like Australia versus a small Pacific island, the challenges and constraints are quite different, and the same solution may not work.
Yeah.
Another question from our students looking at things at the global level was an interest in what changes do you think we might see in the banking sector with cryptocurrency and other things like that in terms of international development and sustainability?
Yeah, look, I'm certainly not an expert in any of those areas, but I think it is interesting that the trends towards whether it's cryptocurrencies or digital currency movements and digital banking and I think these are all they can all be extremely helpful, and they can also be quite detrimental. So, but the key issue, I think, around, I'll give you another good example. In Australia, for example, and in New Zealand, we're very interested in the seasonal labour, whereby Pacific Island countries can contribute labour into the Australian market, and then that labour can then be, as it is, a really important source of revenue for their families and for their communities back in the Pacific. And so the remittances that they make back into their communities are really important. And in fact, a large proportion of the GDP of some of these countries comes from those remittances. So I know the international finance institutions and the major international banks and domestic banks are now really interested in digital transfers of currencies and finance, because this they can be a really good way of reducing the transaction costs. None of us really want people to earn $1 in Australia and then send it back to Tonga or somewhere in the Pacific and have 20 cents of it removed as a transaction cost, whether it's through Western Union or some other sort of money transfer. And so finding clever digital transmissions of money in order to be able to reduce those transaction costs and make sure that most of that dollar actually finds its way back to the community. So I think there are really exciting new opportunities that exist within that whole finance sector that can be a force for good for development. But I'll leave the sort of issue around cryptocurrencies and things to others. It's not really my field.
Thank you, Jack. Are you familiar with the Venus Project?
Yeah, I had a quick look at it when you showed me the sort of questions that have arisen from the students. So yeah, I had a quick look through that.
And are you able to comment on whether you think it's achievable or your initial thoughts based on that cursory glance?
Oh, any organization that is advocating, a solution to climate change or a solution to development or a solution to health issues or education, every organization wants people to take notice and they want people to support them, which is quite right. But in order to do that, they inevitably want to claim that they're actually going to be able to solve the problem that they're addressing. And so it doesn't surprise me when they make fairly large claims that, if you support us, we will be able to achieve this objective. I would encourage students, I would encourage everybody, especially anybody that's considering supporting or putting time and effort and resources into supporting an organization, is start by being a bit of a skeptic. Start by really questioning, do they really have a firm, do you subscribe to their sort of understanding of the issue and how to address it? I think that I think the way in which they've portrayed a lot of their philosophy, I think is really encouraging, because I think they've really seen that, business can be a force for good, and that it doesn't always necessarily translate that all businesses are bad because they are looking after the interests of their shareholders or their customers or whatever, but a lot of the challenge of climate change and of all these other big issues is going to involve everyone working together, whether it's governments and business and non-governmental organizations and everyone. So I would look to any organization, whether it's the Venus Project or anybody, is to see what are their credentials in terms of forming partnerships with the other different stakeholders that are going to be able to actually reform and make the necessary changes. I think that's really my advice would be, don't take it at face value, but really try to research a little bit more about what they think is achievable and what you think is achievable.
That's really great advice. And with so much information out there, it's important for us all to be critical consumers of information and really look at things from a lot of different perspectives, because like these issues, they're very complex, and it's finding the one that sits well with you. Jack, our students are primarily undergraduate students, and if they wanted to start a career working with, say, international organisations or global companies, what would you suggest they do? What's the first steps that they could take?
Yeah, look, I'm a great believer in following sort of three main sort of general objectives, which in an international environment you'll see become critically important as a sort of introduction into these organizations and to successfully penetrate them. The first one is a master's degree. When I first, because I came from an academic background, I think I started thinking about whether I wanted to follow an academic type of career. And if I did, then I would have to do a PhD. But I decided fairly early on that I didn't want to go down an academic. I wanted to get involved at a more practical level. I wanted to be, you know, whatever route I chose was going to be working, you know, in a sector and not just sort of on the outside looking in. So then a master's degree becomes so much more important. And for a lot of these organizations, whether it's the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, it's compulsory. You'll see on all of their job qualifications that a master's degree. So number one, get a master's, but don't do it immediately after your first degree. Have a couple of years gap or 1 or 2 years gap or more. Most of the students I did my master's degree with were actually mature students. So I was one of the youngest, actually. The second sort of key sort of prerequisite is to get some international experience. And that doesn't really, as you said earlier, it doesn't really matter whether that's a job or whether it's I'm on holiday in Fiji and I took the opportunity to go and meet with people who are working in some of these organizations, development agencies, or even government. But trying to get any kind of international experience, and you will find that you draw on that very quickly in any interview, any job interview. You know, when I was moving from Britain to France to go and work for the International Fertilizer Association, you know, I didn't have much experience outside the UK for obvious reasons. I'd just finished school and I had done a master's degree and I had worked in the UK. But the fact that I was able to refer back to experience in Papua New Guinea and Australia, and the fact that I'd worked with land care, and, you know, boy, that was hugely important. So get some international experience, no matter what it is or where it is or how you get it, but you've got to have that to draw on. And the third area, as I said before, is a language, or more than one, or just much more sort of being able to draw on different cultural experiences that language will allow you to do. I think those are the three main sort of key ingredients that I would look for in any sort of candidate that was coming to apply for a position in any of these organizations.
Thanks,
I guess
Jack.
I'll just quickly continue on that. It's just so important to differentiate yourself. I know there are going to be some questions later on about how do I actually get started. One of the things I would suggest is that when I'm looking at positions, or when I'm sort of searching for somebody to fill a particular position, you can imagine that there are dozens, if not hundreds of CVs will arrive. And some of them, you know, well, they all start to look the same, you know, and so therefore you really need to find a way to differentiate yourself. It doesn't matter what that is, something that will spark some additional kind of interest. And I would actually place, and I always do, place a great deal of importance on the cover letter or the cover email or whatever. But the CVs all look the same, but the cover letter reveals so much more about who you are and what your ambitions are and what you like and what you don't like, what your objectives are. And then in that respect, the other piece of advice I always give is to practice your writing, because, you know, there's nothing worse than reading a cover letter that is badly constructed, it's got bad grammar, and the worst of all things is to have spelling mistakes, because it just shows that you haven't proofread it. And so I would actually put even more time and attention into the cover letter than into the CV, and make the CV as short as possible. I'm not saying make the cover letter long, no way. In fact, I was reading a very big organization based here in Sydney, which is recruiting a lot of people at the moment. and they wanted a cover letter that had to be no more than 1 page, and if it was discarded. So it's pretty important that you get that page right. So I would say, in addition to those 3 things, masters, international experience, and language, is writing skills, because your whole career is going to be all about writing and writing reports and writing applications and writing proposals. So writing becomes one of the critical factors.
Thanks, Jack. And that reiterates things that we tell students, and we can provide support for them in the area of putting those cover letters and things together. But it's really nice to hear what it looks like from the other side. So where do organisations advertise opportunities, or how can a person make an approach?
Yeah, so internships are you're almost ubiquitous, and I would certainly encourage anybody who's interested to follow these kinds of opportunities to start looking within their internship programs, and they all have them. They're usually it's pretty evident on their websites, so it's not difficult to find out about it. But in fact, just the other day, I had a young guy who had actually done an environmental science degree here in Australia and had been working for a few years, but was looking for the next challenge and was interested in environmental land management here in Australia. And I used to have a lot to do with an organisation called Bush Heritage, and I was pointing him in that direction. And I looked up Bush Heritage's website, and wow, they had a fantastic list of not just jobs, but also templates that you can then submit your application to become an intern. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, that it was really well structured, obviously well managed. And so, but I guess the point that I'd like to make about internships is, don't assume that if they don't have an internship program advertised or promoted, that they don't do internships. And I would always encourage you that if you've got a particular organisation that you like, that you're attracted to, or you think might be interesting and exciting, just write to them, and say, I'm interested in what you do, and I would be interested to come and become an intern or volunteer to do something, or to shadow one of your officers that's working in a particular country or whatever. I'm always a great believer in not just waiting for things to be advertised. Get on the front foot, and again, differentiate yourself by writing to somebody. It might come as some surprise, I don't know, but the thing that a lot of people working in these organizations, as I said before, they're now getting 50 or 100 emails every day, and about a whole range of different things, and just adding one more email is hard for them. It sort of tends to get brushed aside because there's always a priority. But what these officers and managers and directors and everything working in these organizations now very rarely receive is a letter. It's extraordinary that there's, in fact, some of these organizations don't even have a reception that allows the letters to arrive and be fielded to the right people. But I would honestly encourage you to write a letter, because it's the one thing that's going to get noticed. And you might be surprised about the strength of the response that you get. So don't always think that just because something's not advertised that it doesn't exist. Find other ways of opening up a discussion or a dialogue with the right people.
That's excellent advice, Jack. And it is an interesting point, particularly in some countries, culturally, a typed letter has quite a lot of significance. So that's a really interesting takeaway for me.
Yeah, just on that point, Asian Development Bank, I was reminded by the fact that on the Asian Development Bank, every email and every letter and everything that's written, there's always a fax number. And I remember people saying to us, why do you put fax numbers on there? I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's like went out with the ark. I mean, faxes, this just nobody uses faxes anymore. And then we had to say, well, actually, yes, they do, because in the Pacific, very much, sometimes fax is the most reliable form of communication to some of these countries, and especially in government departments. And so sometimes actually having the fax number on there was quite important, and there was a reason behind it. So I'm not suggesting that you should go out and buy a fax machine, but I'm thinking that sometimes looking for an alternative is a clever way of getting noticed.
Yeah, certainly, Jack. That's an excellent takeaway. I think there's a fax machine in a cupboard somewhere around the place. Some key takeaways from me today are the importance of building your network. And I think that's very well evidenced in your career, which has traversed lots of different areas. And it's something that we can start doing right now. Also, differentiating yourself, as you said, all resumes can start to look the same, and it's making yourself stand out in a good way, not because you've done a big spelling mistake, that makes you the person that the interviewer is going to want to meet. Being really proactive and being creative about the ways that you make your approach, and thinking about taking opportunities where they are, or creating opportunities, for example, when you're traveling for other purposes, to make some connections that way. And your definite points, which included a master's degree, and also taking the time to perhaps build in a break in your study to gain some experience, and also, I guess, focus where you want to take your master's degree, and other lifelong learning opportunities like the Australian Institute of Company Directors courses, and getting that international experience. And not only will that help you when you go for jobs, but also help you understand whether or not that kind of work is actually for you by experiencing it as your career is developing. Jack, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Look, on that last point, I think, finding ways to differentiate yourself. Another little clever trick, I think, which is always worth exploring, and that is, everybody always says, but you've got to know the right person to contact. And while that's true, sometimes, because in many of the organizations that I've worked with, they work on the basis of projects. And so sometimes those projects might be, 1 year long, or 2 years, or 3 years. And very often they recruit people in to be part of a team for a particular project. And if they're not at the beginning of a project development or the design phase of a project, then they don't have any positions available. So if you write to that person and say, have you got any positions available? They'll just write back and say no. Whereas if you write to somebody, whether it's me or someone in one of these organizations, it's often better to say, can you please point me to the right person? Because if you do that, then you take the pressure off the person you're writing to, because then they know that they're not expected to kind of respond to you positively necessarily. But most people are more than happy to direct you to somebody else. And that is often a much more powerful method of introducing yourself to the right people, getting that sort of third-party endorsement, than it is to try to go directly. And my experience is that most people are more than happy to sort of help to navigate you towards the right person, even if they're not the right person themselves.
Excellent. I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks very much, Jack. It's been really interesting to hear about your career, even though we've worked together in the past on and off. There are always parts of your story that are new to me. So thank you very much for sharing that with our students in the Academy, and look forward to seeing what's next.
No problem at all. Thanks, Wendy, and good luck to everybody. I know it's been a terribly difficult last couple of years, but hopefully things are only going to improve from now on. So good luck to you all. Thanks very much.